It's a great pleasure to be back in Malmö, but I should say there is nobody who is more boring than someone who's just written a book and they think the book is saying something in which they believe and you're not sure if anybody else will. The new book that's just come out is called The Corruption of Capitalism: Why Rentiers Thrive and Work Does Not Pay. And I have a few copies if anybody is still interested at the end of my talk. The Precariat is something I've been writing about for probably 30 years. And the book that I wanted to produce in 2011 was an attempt to reach out to members of the Precariat in a narrative that could be easily understood. It's had a life that I could never have anticipated. It's been translated into 19 languages and has taken me all over the world. And every single day I receive emails and other communications from people all over the world who say they belong to the Precariat. This book is about them and they want to tell me their story. And many, if not most of those stories make me angry, make me sad, make me furious with the politicians and with the structures that are producing the pain they receive. Now, a conference like yours on human rights is rightly, correctly, mainly about the great crimes against humanity. And this is really about the slashing of swords to us as people around the world. My story is not like that. It's more about 1,000 small cuts, many of them not even felt until the consequences come later. It's a different sort of challenge to human rights. We must start with the realization that rights always have begun with class-based demands against the state of the time. Going way back to Magna Carta, the demands for rights and for the entrenchment of rights. But of course, people gain rights and they also lose rights. And in many people's cases, they're blocked from advancing further with rights. And always, of course, human rights have been in tension, in conflict to a certain extent, with citizenship. Citizenship is an exclusionary concept and therefore always risks having conflict with the wider area of human rights. And the concept that I advanced in the second book, which has been translated also into Swedish as well as the first one, was denizens. It's not an original concept, it goes back to the Middle Ages. A denizen, in the ideas of the Middle Ages, was someone who went into a town and was given a more limited range of rights than the citizens of the town. And the way that it's been interpreted by sociologists and political scientists in the last 30 years is that a denizen is an in-between an alien and a citizen. And I want to explain the Precariat as a special form of denizen. Because historically speaking, the idea of a denizen was an advance, a progression. You went from being an outsider to being an insider. For the Precariat, it's been the other way round for millions of people. They've been going from being citizens to being denizens and outsiders. It's a very special 21st century process that's very sad. But we also have a situation where people are getting inside, but they're being blocked from going any further. Also quite different from what used to be the case. Now, my narrative is that we're undergoing a global transformation. It's been dominated in the first phase by neoliberalism, or what we now call neoliberalism, the commodification of everything that can be commodified, the privatization, and all of that you know about. But the key for understanding what the implications for rights and the Precariat is that systematically the neoliberal project has involved the dismantling of all institutions and mechanisms of social solidarity. They stand against the market. But all those institutions not only stand against the market, but give us a zone of citizenship, a micro citizenship, where you enter a community and you learn the ethics and standards of that community and become a member, and you learn from those who have the experience of that community who hand down the values. Those values are reproduced. We have a lovely term in English, probably in Swedish too, the idea of grandfathering. It means more to me than it used to, but there you are. Grandfathering, handing down those values. It helps reproduce the ethics of our humanity. If you dismantle those institutions, you strip the zone of values. And what we've seen is that neoliberalism has morphed, has become a situation of rentier capitalism, where intellectual property rights, so-called rights, are triumphing over all other rights and providing sources of rental income which is extracting from the majority of us for a tiny rentier class. We've seen that, and that I document in my new book, and I won't focus on that in the remainder of my talk. But if you think of things like the firm, the corporation, that used to provide people with a narrative for their life. They were members of a corporation, of a firm. They went as an apprentice, and they were expected to go through it. And that was part of your community. It gave you your security, your identity. For more and more people today, the firm is a commodity. It's commodified. It splits and it goes all over the world. And you're not likely to stay in a firm that gives you that community. The same with occupations. The occupations used to be guilds where you entered and you learned the ethics and crafts and standards, and as you went up through your life. They've been stripped. Even more importantly, the education system used to be primarily conceived as something that stood outside the market and gave people their values and their competencies to stand as citizens against the market. Today, every part of the world, you're seeing a commodification of education in which the values of culture, history, art, philosophy, you don't need them because they don't help you get a bloody job. So they're being whittled away. And also the commons. The commons are being plundered, commercialized, enclosed. The commons provided what has been called the parliament of the people, the agora, the place where we interact and reproduce our values. They're shrinking. Now, in that context, a global class structure has taken shape with a plutocracy, an elite. I've described these before. They're described in the book, so I won't go into those now. It'll make my blood boil, so, I prefer not to. Underneath, you have a salariat, people with employment security, pensions, etc., shrinking in number. But all these three groups are increasingly detached from society, detached from having values of social solidarity, because they don't expect to be down there. So they will support a utilitarian politics of majority. And never mind about the minority, because I'm not going to be in the minority. So you lose chip, the sense of altruism, empathy, the hugely important sentiment of empathy. The old proletariat, which was the support base of the Social Democrats, the Labour parties, the trade unions, shrinking everywhere and being tipped downwards in many cases into the precariat. And besides the precariat, you have a lumpen precariat, people out in the streets dying prematurely without any rights at all, except if we give them a little in their pockets. Now, the precariat is wanted by global capitalism. It is not an underclass, as I've often emphasized. But I want to emphasize a few of the rights-based issues of the definition, not go through the full definition again. Essentially, the first thing is that the precariat is being subject to very distinctive relations of production. It's having to be habituated to accept unstable labor without the prospect of stable labor. That's not so important if you had other institutions. I wouldn't mind changing jobs. Jolly good idea. We shouldn't want to be in the same job for 1,000 years. But in addition, people in the precariat don't have an occupational identity or narrative. That's a fundamental economic right, to be able to practice what you're qualified and want to practice. But the precariat cannot do that, so they're not possessing that vital economic right. And the new systems of regulations of occupations, which involve licensing, have become methods of excluding huge numbers of people from practicing what they're perfectly qualified to do. It's a loss of an economic right. In addition, the precariat has to do a lot of work for labor. Work that doesn't get remunerated, doesn't get recognized, but they have to do it. So they're exploited much more than appears from the wage rates that they get. It's a form of deprivation of economic rights. And they also lose cultural rights because they cannot belong to a community that reproduces their values and gives them support in times of need. And they're losing political rights because they cannot get union representation, they cannot get political parties to represent their interests, they're ignored, and they're subject to workfare. In other words, they're forced to have to do jobs they don't wish to do, their freedom is denied, and they're treated as second-class people. The next aspect that I want to emphasize is the distinctive relations of distribution that the precariat have to accept. For 30 years, real wages, on average, have stagnated around the world in the OECD countries, while gradually rising in China and emerging market economies. But not only have they been stagnant, for the precariat, they've been falling in real terms. And they've been losing non-wage forms of remuneration, paid holidays, pensions, medical leave, whatever it might be. They're losing the sources of security, of income security. And increasingly, data show that if you're in the precariat, your wage income is very volatile. So you have no economic security. You are also losing rights-based social benefits, state benefits. A shift away from universal rights in the form of benefits and social insurance benefits to means-tested social assistance. Anybody who knows anything about social protection realizes once you go in that direction, as every country has been doing, you automatically create horrible poverty traps where people, if they manage to get a benefit, face marginal tax rates of 80% or more in going from benefits to low-wage jobs that are available for them. That's actually worse because they also face precarity traps. More and more people don't get rights to social benefits and have to queue, fill forms, fill more forms, queue, come back, please some bureaucrat, be deferential. They don't have the right. They have to ask. They have to plead. And this creates tremendous costs, and you can easily work it out for millions of people around Europe going from low benefits into low-wage jobs that are temporary. You actually lose money. They haven't got a right in those circumstances. They face uncertainty, unknown unknowns. It's one of those little cuts because that's stressful. It means if you make one mistake or have one illness or one unfortunate incident, you could be impoverished and face a very uncertain future. This loss of rights goes with the loss of civil rights, the great civil right of due process, that if you have something taken away from you, you can appeal and get it back if it's unfairly taken. If you're a woman with a small child living in a small town and you can't afford the bus fare or whatever it might be, you can't get your appeal going. You don't have a voice in the system. And so you don't have civil rights. And meanwhile, governments are quietly reducing legal cost availability, making representation harder, raising the costs for doing appeals, etc., making it even harder. And many of the emails I receive are from people all over the place saying how they've been humiliated and lost and given up. The next aspect of the Precariat is that they have distinctive relations to the state. And it is most important, this, because the difference between the old proletariat and the Precariat is that the proletariat, the primary enemy was the boss, capital, the boss, the bastard, you know. For the Precariat, the primary enemy is the state. And what is happening is more and more people in the Precariat are being converted into denizens, losing civil rights, losing cultural rights, losing social rights, losing political rights, and losing economic rights. So we have a continuum. Lots of people have lost all five, some have lost two or three, but you have a continuum. And this leads to the defining feature of being in the Precariat. You are a supplicant. You have to ask for favors. That's the reality of the Precariat, not anything about labor relations. It's the fact that in society, you are a supplicant with unaccountable domination by bureaucrats, figures of authority against you. All those petty little cuts. But a lot of people can't take it and are committing horrible things to themselves or suicide. It's chipping away at our society. This conversion into denizens is beautifully caught by an image that I've been playing around with in my head. It's like walking on sinking sand. And you try to run to get out of the sand, but you continue to sink. You don't seem to make any progress. When I've said that to people, meetings of the Precariat, a lot of people say, hey, That's me. Now, at the moment, the Precariat is split into 3 factions. The first faction, or group, consists of people who've fallen out of old working class communities or families, and they relate their deprivation to an imaginary or real past. And they can't have that past, but they've heard about it, they've experienced it. Now, this group doesn't have a lot of education, and therefore it listens to the voices of neo-fascist populism. Their latest champion is Donald Trump. I hope that's not an applause for Donald Trump. He, of course, has epitomized this part of the Precariat. And I cannot tell you how many journalists have contacted me since his election. But not only journalists. Big corporations, chief executives, and representatives of corporate capitalism have also been contacting me because they don't want Donald Trump to be winning any more than most of us in this room. Because he promises an authoritarian reaction, a denial of rights to that second part of the Precariat, and to a lot of other people, and a sort of old-style nationalism that goes with a particular version of citizenship that we remember from the early part of the 20th century. The second part of the Precariat consists of the migrants, the refugees, the minorities, the Roma, the Muslims, whatever it might be that can be demonized by these populists. This group, of course, has the fewest rights of any of us. They struggle but keep their heads down, but every now and then the pressures get too great and they explode in days of rage. And being a migrant myself, but a very privileged one by relative standards, I hope all of us can understand that pressure and the reactions that come from time to time. These are what I call the nostalgics in the Precariat. The first group has a sense of relative deprivation from a lost past. The nostalgics haven't got a present, haven't got a home. They don't belong. They haven't got a sense of belonging. And of course, they have been losing all rights. And what distinguishes this group today from the past, relatively speaking, is that there are blockages for making progress from being an alien to a denizen to a citizen. Fewer and fewer of them can make that progression, especially in the context of class-based migration policy, which give oligarchs and the rich immediate entry. Please come into our country. You have all rights. Where the barriers are going up and the walls, real and imaginary, are going up. The third group in the Precariat are what I've called the progressives. They're the ones who go to university, college. They don't vote for Brexit or for Trump or Marine Le Pen next year. But they don't like what they've seen by contrast. If you had been in Britain, you might have understood that the choice of Brexit involved either going for Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson with their stupid nationalism and venal racism, or you go for David Cameron, promising years of austerity, cutting benefits, increasing inequality, the privileged plutocracy, funding his party, etc. Don't be surprised if a lot of the young part of the Precariat, the educated part, looking at the two choices, stayed in bed. Hillary Clinton suffered from the stay in bed part of the Precariat recently. But this part of the Precariat is not going to go to the far right. It's looking for a politics of paradise. And that politics of paradise is beginning to take shape. I think we are at a fantastic moment because Trump and Trumpism is a wake-up call for all of us. There is no excuse for any of us to sit back and do nothing politically or socially in the context of what's happening at the moment. No excuse. Don't grumble if you're not doing something. It's basically what we should say to ourselves. It's really that important. Now, next year happens to be the 800th anniversary of the founding document of our constitutions. The Magna Carta only came into being in 1217, and it only became the Magna Carta because alongside of it was a minor Carta, the Charter of the Forest. This Charter of the Forest was the first set of demands made against the state for the right of subsistence, the right of every common man and common woman to have a right to subsistence. It was also the first ecological charter, the first charter that said we have to preserve the commons, all parts of the commons, and form reparations if anybody has taken it away and force them to pay back to society. Remarkable document for 800 years ago. It was also the first feminist charter. The first time, only in small ways, but it was a step forward towards giving the rights to women, in particular widows. It says clearly, every widow has the right to subsistence and use of the commons unchecked. And every widow has the right to refuse to have to remarry. That's a fundamental right. The right to say no. And for me, the 800th anniversary next year would be a wonderful opportunity for us to present a progressive agenda of rights from the perspective of the Precariat. Some of you will remember that a famous sociologist, I'm an economist, so I have to constantly borrow from sociology, T.H. Marshall, said that the 17th century was the century in which civil rights advanced. The 18th century was the century of cultural rights advancing. The 19th century was the century of political rights advancing. And the 20th century was the century in social rights were advancing. I think you can document with ease that all of these rights have been eroded in the last 30 years, the period of globalization, but we know roughly what we want with those. And we will defend them more and more. We have to. But the 21st century should be the century of economic rights. And in that regard, we have to advance the Enlightenment again from the perspective of the Precariat. That's why I wrote this book, Precariat Charter. And the perspective of the Precariat means, first of all, the Enlightenment values of liberté, which doesn't mean just individual freedom, it means associational freedom that Aristotle and Hannah Arendt and others promoted. Republican freedom, the freedom to be in society not facing domination by figures of authority who are unaccountable. If you're in the Precariat, you don't have that freedom. So we have to fight all over again for Republican freedom. We also have to fight for égalité, again from the perspective of the Precariat. The Precariat faces much greater insecurity and inequality than is measured just by incomes. The inequality of security in society is much greater than the inequality of incomes. If you're up here in the salariat or the elite, you have total security. You can buy it. If you're down in the precariat, you have no security at all. We need a strategy to give basic security to everybody. Similarly, with time. Up here, you can control your time. You probably do it badly, but you can. If you're down in the precariat, you have no control of your time. You have suffered from the precariatized mind, stress. Your leisure is snatched periods of watching TV because you're too tired, if you've got a TV. We need a strategy, a politics of time to liberate time, control of time, quality time. A slow time movement. It's a fundamental right. The right to be lazy. It's a valuable thing that Aristotle understood. Everybody has to have urgia, laziness, because you cannot be a citizen without being lazy. We've turned it into a sin, a modern day sin. But it's not a sin. We need it. I need it. You need it. Everybody needs it. And we also need a strategy for redistributing quality space. The shrinking of the commons, the commercialization of the commons, the plunder of the commons is depriving people in the precariat in their cities of space where they can common, to common. It used to be a verb, the commons. I gave a speech at Bergen recently, and I was asked to give an imaginary speech. And I said that I'd gone walking in Bergen, lovely town, as you know, and I'd met a lady from the future. And this lady of the future, she said, "What are you doing?" She said, "In 2030, it's good." I said, "What do you mean 2030? We're in 2016. She said, "What are you doing? It's not. It's 2030. I said, "What were you talking about?" She said, "Don't you realize what happened in 2017? She said, "Well, late in the year, a revolt started. That revolt started with people waving copies of a Charter of the Forest, and they started on the Thames." I said, "The Thames?" She said, "Yes, there was a group of privateers, people rent-seeking, who've taken part of the Thames and have built a private bridge over the Thames. It's called the Garden Bridge. They're making millions out of it, but it came to the launch and the opening of this bridge, this privatized bridge over the iconic national river. And that day sparked a revolt. People said, "No, our commons is our commons." And one thing led to another. And then she went on, and I told the story. I'm not going to tell the full story. But basically she said, people realized we cannot go on with this inequality, insecurity, deprivation for millions, while the plutocracy and the rest thrive. And it led to pressure on the politicians to make changes. And they introduced a basic income. It was introduced not for all the reasons that I've been arguing for a basic income, but because it was a political imperative. There was a necessity to rebuild the income distribution system that had broken down irretrievably. And it was realized that unless the ordinary people and the people in the precariat have provided with basic income security, the revolt will turn to the far right more and more. And wisdom prevailed. a new income distribution system was built. I don't think the lady of the future was such a wild person. It's a matter of struggle, a new type of politics that we need. But today we stand at a very dangerous point. And unless it's realized by enough of us that we have to be transformative, not revolutionary, not like the old sense, but fight for economic rights, fight for social rights, political rights, and basically transform the ugliness that we see around us. I think we can do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We have a volunteer and we have a microphone, so we want you, the audience, to get a chance to ask some questions to Guy while here. So we're passing the microphone around. Questions, don't be shy. Was that? Oh.
But nobody can see.
Oh, there we have. Okay, great.
Hello, Guy. We met yesterday. We're as an association to try to lift these questions. But do we have to be a political party to make a difference? Or can you do it as an association lifting just the basic questions?
Answer? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and first of all, I enjoyed meeting your group last night, and I hope others will join you because there's a sort of Precariat group here in Malmö and trying to raise these issues and other issues, and a really good group. I wish you every success. The question actually is addressed to the final chapter in the latest book, and I did it through a sort of Socratic dialogue I had with a Polish intellectual who was a bit pessimistic. And I basically am arguing that in some countries it will be a new political movement, like Podemos in Spain, or Alternativet in Denmark, or in Poland, Razem, which is a Precariat political movement that has emerged. In others, it might be internal reform of old left parties because they're dead men walking. And basically, I was asked by Noam Chomsky what I thought of Jeremy Corbyn. I said, I'm not religious, but if I were religious, I would say he's closer to being John the Baptist than Jesus Christ. He's doing a great job clearing the decks. The third way and Blairism now is dead. That's great. I don't think he's got the answers, but they're asking better questions. The same with Bernie Sanders and people like that. So we're seeing two types of models. The third is the most worrying at the moment, is a lot of young people in particular are basically saying politics, they're all the same, they're all useless, and I think there's no excuse for that. But I think that we're seeing a political re-engagement, and it's taken place since the Occupy movements of 2011, which transformed the Precariat from being an object into being a subject. What I mean by that is that instead of looking in a mirror, if you have a mirror, looking in the mirror and seeing a failure, millions of people have started looking in that mirror and saying, this is a structural situation. I am part of the Precariat and I'm proud of it, whether they use that word or whatever. And therefore, that leads to a sense of recognition, and that's the first step for fight back. So I think we're at that stage at the moment, but exciting things are taking place.
Thank you for this excellent presentation.
Can't see.
Yes,
Oh, there she is.
I'm over here.
Oh yeah,
In
great.
the far back.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I also reflect a bit like Matthias also here. we need to be transformative. This is a very sensitive time. And going out, I can recognize a lot of what you're saying. I meet a lot of people who feel that they are in this class. This is quite common. But sometimes people try to organize themselves and do small movements, civil society, some small communities, but they don't get anywhere with it. And so a year or two or so, and then they kind of lose hope, a bit like the guy you said had felt humiliated and then lost hope. So what advice would you give these movements who are trying? Where do we start with this transformative movement?
I think it's a very good point. If you look historically, whenever a transformation's taken place, as Karl Polanyi, the Great Transformation, for example, the ugliness took place, and it took 50 years or more before the counter actions crystallized and were strong enough. I think today the evolution of these dynamics is much faster. You know, we're seeing new movements and new structures emerging very quickly after the ugliness started, particularly since 2008. So I think that that's quite promising. In terms of practical things, I think it's very healthy if precariat groups are setting up in towns, in communities, and either becoming political themselves, as some of these cases are, or infiltrating parties like Momentum and various others, transforming them and getting young, educated and not educated people back into politics. Because the future is going to depend on mobilization of the young people who understand the precariat from being in it. And I think that is taking place in a number of countries. And there will be cases of 2 steps forward, 1 back, 1 forward, 2 back. But the dynamic, the energy out there is really quite something.
Hello.
Where can I?
Over here.
Where?
Your right.
Oh, beg your pardon.
Yeah, it's okay.
Very difficult.
Hey, my name is Sanne Pettersson. I'm a part of the third group you described. And I'm actually active in a political party. And we've just put our budget. And we are also for basic income. And I almost started crying when you described my life, basically. I managed to stay put, but I was about to go outside and have a little cry because, yeah. So thank you so very much. And my political party, we're not so big. We're trying to become bigger, of course. But do you have some kind of tip or anything that we can do to, I don't know, some kind of research you have done or anything that we can use to put an enlightenment on these issues and, yeah, get it happening?
First of all, I thank you for staying and wish you success at a personal level and political level. I think we are in a very interesting phase also in terms of political developments. 7 years ago, I was invited by SEWA, the Self-Employed Women's Association of India, with whom I've been working for 20 years, to give a talk on basic income. And their leaders, all friends of mine, were very polite, and they listened, and in their best saris and nice comments. And then a couple of young women stood up. They'd been talking to each other, and they said, "Why don't we do it here?" You can imagine, for me, this was music. Why don't we experiment here in India? So we launched a basic income pilot. It took us 3 years to get approval, raise the money, to, all the planning. And we provided 6,000 men, women, and children with a basic income for nearly 2 years. And we compared what happened with them with 6,000 other people, similar people who didn't receive the basic income. And we measured the effects. We produced a book. So I've got some flyers for it if you're interested, which showed the welfare effects for health, nutrition, sanitation, schooling were all fantastically positive. It showed the equity effects were great. In other words, the disadvantaged groups in those communities benefited more than others. The women, the disabled, the frail, the scheduled castes. It also showed the economic effects, contrary to what the middle class people were saying, that they'll all be lazy if you give them a basic income. In every community, the amount of work went up. The productivity of the work went up. The economic dynamism of those communities improved. Entrepreneurialism, small scale, went up. And the income distribution narrowed. And the fourth effect was that it had an emancipatory value greater than the money value. And that was illustrated, as I think I said last time I came to Malmö, by women who, when we first went to one of those villages, they all wore veils. All the young women wore veils. They wouldn't have their picture taken for the cards. We had to arrange in huts. When I went back after 7 or 8 months, I noticed that none of the young women were wearing veils. So I said to my colleagues, "Have you noticed?" They said, "No." I said, "No, wearing veils." "Well, that's true." We called some of the women over and we asked them, "Why are you not wearing your veil as you used to?" Aha. Before we had to do what the elders told us what to do. Now we have a bit of money of our own. We decide for ourselves. That's emancipation. And I believe that through experimentation, through lobbying, it took us 5 years. And 2 weeks ago, I get very emotional about this, so I'll match you. 2 weeks ago, I got an email and a phone call from the chief economic advisor to the Indian government saying they're going to come out next month, with a report saying a basic income should be introduced in India.
Wow.
Maybe I'll leave the room before you do.
Do we have any last questions?
Yes, is this working?
Yes.
My name is Jens Järndal. I'm the president of the board of the Swedish party Enhet, which is the first Swedish party that has a basic income on its party program, and I think the only one that's had it since day one, consistently. And I think it's a very valid question if this has to be channeled through a political party. And I believe it has, because after all, political change takes place in parliament. And if you're not a political party, you have no say in parliament. Actually, Enhet became the 11th largest party in Sweden in the last election in 2014, and we intend to grow, and basic income is the basic of our politics, basically, and I think we are the only party who can say that so far. In Parliament, there's no party that has it on its program. Thank you.
Well, thank you. We've met before, and I understand your position. I think it's going to be very interesting that people will come towards it from different angles, and it's very important for us to be non-partisan about it. I think you're perfectly right to be saying what you say, because we should welcome everybody who comes to this party. the party for promoting income security for the precariat. What I've been impressed with in the last couple of years, I'm getting a bit worried to be respectable, but that more and more people in the mainstream, Nobel Prize winning economists, Nobel Peace Prize winners, prominent politicians in various parties have suddenly come out in favour. I'm delighted, for example, that Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell in the British Labour Party have come out essentially in favour. John strongly supports it. I'm glad that some parties of right of centre, left of centre, Blessed is the child who has many godfathers, because you'll get lots of Christmas presents. And I think it's important for all of us to say, look, it's a different context now. You may have been opposed to it in the past for whatever reason, but please have an open mind today. Reconsider these things, because we're confronted with a genuine economic, political, fiscal, ecological crisis. And it requires different answers to different questions, and that's the context. So I salute you, but please others join as much as possible.